Hi, I'm Will Webb, and this is Why You Should Watch. In this episode, we're discussing the 2017 TV series/film Twin Peaks: The Return, directed by David Lynch. Heads up, if you experience photosensitivity or motion sickness, skip ahead to the timestamp shown on screen now. And also, beware spoilers for the first two series of the show and the accompanying film Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me, as well as some very lightly spoilery references to Lynch's previous work.
Hallo, I stand buffer. I'll see you again in 25 years. Meanwhile,
Let's kick off just by talking about how you came to Twin Peaks: The Return, and maybe more broadly Lynch's work. Or I should say that although this is a recommendation for Twin Peaks: The Return specifically, definitely wouldn't recommend just jumping straight in with series 3.
Yeah, no. I would definitely advise watching the first two seasons of the film before you jump straight in. And even then, you're still jumping straight into it. Like,
I had to keep on stopping and just being like Googling people's names to be like, was that person in the previous show? Or have I just like, no, they're not. I think it is interesting that you chose this versus the rest of it, but we'll get into that. Let's talk about how you first found the film.
I mean, I used to go through all my like older brother's DVD collections, and like I'm not sure if you've got an older sibling, or like I think it's quite a common thing to be very influenced by your older sibling's tastes, and like he had a massive collection of DVDs, and I used to just go in there and pick a random film out. It was like going to a video shop, like, and I found Mulholland Drive when I was probably about 15, 16, and yeah, after watching that, I was sort of like, you know, confused and scared and fascinated all in equal measure, and I thought I was like, what did I just watch? But like in a good way. It wasn't like what did I just watch? It was like, what did I just watch? It was you know, it was a really good feeling, and it was like, you know, I was only 15, 16. I'd never seen anything like that before, and you know, I was looking up like the interpretations and the ideas about what the film could represent and what it meant, and like I was sort of blown away by the fact that this is what a film can be. This is what the medium can present to people. This is the ideas you can convey. And like, obviously after that, I kind of left it for a few years. And then a few years later, I was getting more and more into film. And that's when I realized that it was a David Lynch film. And I started getting properly into David Lynch. And I watched all his film work. And that included, obviously, the first two seasons of Twin Peaks and the film Fire Walk with Me. And obviously 2017 comes around and The Return aired. I'm not really sure what I was expecting with The Return. It was sort of like I was really excited for it, and like I just didn't know which way it was going to go. And like Lynch's more recent stuff was very, very different to his older stuff in a way, and it exceeded my expectations regardless. And like to the point of where it changed how I look at creating and the way I look at creativity and the way I think about like anything really. And it's amazing that something like a film or a TV show can like inspire you in that way.
Well, like you, and as we've been discussing in emails, I'm a big Lynch fan as well. And I actually started off at the same age, about 15, but I started with Inland Empire, which again, I wouldn't recommend as a first.
You started with Inland Empire, yeah.
Yes, this is the first one I watched. And I should say, I think Twin Peaks is probably the ideal jumping on point for Lynch because it has almost everything that encompasses his usual kind of themes, but is really accessible. Like it feels like watching a normal TV show sometimes.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. It's got a few of his more abstract elements, but it's on the whole, it's very watchable. It doesn't really, you know, the abstract elements don't make you feel like you don't really know what's going on because you've got everything else to tie it in. And I agree with that.
And so I had also been obviously really interested in The Return, not least because I don't think Lynch had really made anything since Inland Empire. No films. He'd done a documentary series with one of his kids, and he'd also done 3 albums, which are great. but not films. So that's an interesting kind of like gap in his, you were talking about creativity earlier on. I think it's like he didn't have a break from being a creative. He just stopped making films for a while, or at least feature-length films. I think he did a short or two during that period. And also I was, I think, a little bit unsure about going to see one of those kind of long-waited reboot, like long sequel kind of things, because they're always a bit shit, I suppose. They feel like nostalgic and kind of cozy in a way that I really didn't want Twin Peaks to feel like.
You don't want it to be the exact same thing, do you? You don't want them to just be redoing the same beats and yeah.
You know what it's like. You start off a couple of scenes of the shots of the town, and then it cuts to someone coming in. You realise they got married to their long-term love interest off screen in the gap, and the characters who are played by actors who died aren't in the show anymore, and then they have an explanation of that and things like that. And it can be done well. I actually think the Gilmore Girls like long sequel that they did way later is great, and a really good example of how to completely take over a different kind of idiom for your TV show. But what I was really shocked at watching this is just how little it felt like a nostalgic return to something. It almost feels like it's completely separate to the original show, and all those kind of cozy procedural elements are gone, and it is the most abstract 2 hours. I watched the first 2 episodes only. The most abstract 2 hours of TV I've ever seen. Like, astonishing to think that this went out as a television show.
Oh yeah. It does get, as you carry on, it does get a little bit less abstract, but then it's kind of bookended by the abstract. This kind of like you got a really abstract couple of first episodes, and in the middle, like episode 8, you'll hear everyone talking about episode 8 because it's just a mind-blowing bit of television. And then the last couple of episodes go back again, and it's all kind of bookended by the stuff. And the middle is quite not normal, but it's a bit more. You can follow it a bit better. It's you kind of have more of an idea about what's going on. But it's a really very strange, and I love it.
And so you kind of suggested this to me. Originally I'd said suggest a film, and it's interesting that you chose this, of course, because it was put out as a TV show but conceptualized as a film.
Yeah, so they shot it as an 18-hour film, which must have been a logistical nightmare, really. Like, it must have been very heavy. It must have been a lot of work, and I think I had like a 520-page script or something. So instead of shooting like a normal TV series where they'd shoot an episode at a time, they would have been shooting everything they needed to do at certain locations. So they would have been going to a location and going back and forth between the whole series, shooting different scenes from different episodes. So it must have been it must have been a lot. It must have been a hell of a lot to do, especially since Lynch is getting on a bit, and like that must have been so much work for him to do. And I've seen a lot of on the Blu-ray, there's like a lot of behind the scenes content, and you can see him getting a bit angry at points, and it just seems like a hell of a lot to do, but they pulled it off, which is kind of amazing.
And in that sense, I think he's more like an artist and less like a traditional filmmaker sometimes, because the kind of planning required for a traditional film shoot is so like rational brain kind of stuff. And he's much more like someone who's like, say, a painter who might return to the same motif over a number of years and then pull in works from much earlier on into one show. And that's what I feel like Lynch's work is like sometimes, where he's returning to these interests, like with Mulholland Drive reflecting both Lost Highway and Inland Empire in terms of covering roughly the same themes and even having similarly structured plots. But the biggest thing for me that really made me think of it as a film was the pacing of the show. Because versus the rest of TV, it's slow. It really takes its time getting anywhere in that first 2 hours.
Yeah, it's extremely slow. I mean, that's the thing, because obviously they shot it as a film and they just split it up into sections. So it's not like they planned each episode to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's just a continuation of what's been happening in the previous. So it's like, it's kind of, at first, it's a bit difficult to get your head around. It's a bit difficult to watch something that doesn't necessarily have a comfortable end. And I remember watching it on when it was first being aired, and it was kind of really unsatisfying because of the way things weren't wrapped up quite nicely, and you're gonna have to wait another week to watch the next thing. But then when it came out on Blu-ray, obviously I just binged the whole 18 hours in like a couple of days, and it's a lot better watching it like that. I'm surprised actually they didn't, on the Blu-ray, they didn't have the choice to watch it all as one straight. I'm not sure whether I can't remember whether on more than one disc.
Would it fit? Yeah.
Yeah, but that would have been a nice feature if possible.
And I think you're right to call it unsettling that sometimes this Twin Peaks show just stops.
Yeah.
And I think that works quite nicely for Lynch. It feels very like a Lynch thing to do. You suddenly cut to something even within the show, the scene transitions don't seem to flow. They don't seem to make much sense sometimes. They're kind of more associative than they are story-based. And so it can just stop. Like, it's not a problem. And so you did a video that I really enjoyed on your channel, the name of which has now escaped me, kind of about abstract filmmaking and about using imagery, like a creative exercise, using imagery to tell stories or at least kind of bring along associations. And I was wondering if you were talking about how Lynch has kind of inspired you to think about that in your own work as well. I certainly noticed there's lots of more associative and abstract stuff in this Twin Peaks than the previous series, like the floor of the Red Room kind of swirling around and the curtains kind of billowing and stuff like that recurs a lot. So I was wondering if you could kind of touch on that for us.
That video, that YouTube video, that was actually me trying to bridge the gap between a sponsored video and an educational video. And obviously, like educational talking about creativity is really, really difficult because, like, you can teach creativity to an extent, but it's really difficult to actually, like, just try and teach someone to, like, think creatively. You can't just do that, can you? And I think it's more about intuition and, like, fitting things together in your head. And so with that video, I was trying to kind of add that into, like, the stock footage element of it. So obviously go get a load of stock footage, whack it all together, see if you can make connections in there. They don't have to be logical connections. They can be, you know, like, just ideas or, like, moods or themes, and you can just put it all together. And it's a really good way to kind of teach yourself to think about, like, intuitive connections between things rather than trying to logically connect everything together. And I think that's a lot of what Lynch does in his work, and especially with The Return, it's like a major, like, representation of his ideas and his ways of working. And so he uses a lot of intuition in his work.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, really, where it's about the way that Lynch thinks, maybe more than it's about even him trying to translate that to a previously established kind of form. And as he's gotten, because he started off very abstract with Eraserhead, but Eraserhead actually has quite a strong narrative, so there's a lot of weird stuff in it, but there's a story that is told quite clearly throughout the film.
Yeah, there's an anchor to it, and you know what's going on, but it's got those abstractions within the story, yeah.
And I think he's gotten slowly more confident, especially in his later work. And I'm thinking about kind of Lost Highway onwards, about deciding just like, well, I can just be associative and I can trust the audience to come with me. I always remember in the opening of Mulholland Drive, which has that really disorientating, kind of shoddy green screen, like ballroom dancing.
Yeah.
And it's like all these people kind of like superimposed over each other, and then a very strongly flat, like bleached lit shot of her in step printing kind of fading into view in the front of it. And so it's so divorced really from what most film, even the more abstract films, try to do about building a consistent and technically good world. And instead it's like just showing you the insight into his head, where he's thinking, yeah, the dancing, then the girl with the white light, and then we cut to the car crash. And that's the movie, and that's how it's going to make sense.
In your head, you don't have really high quality CGI, do you? You just have images and shapes, and, like, you can imagine sounds, and, like, that's more like how your inside of your head works than, like, you know, all these big budget effects. And so it's kind of like more of an internal realization of the idea than it is like a filmic cinematic realization.
I think as well, he's not even really concerned with the technical aspects sometimes, because it's less about pulling you into a world. Like, he's not trying to create a world that you're fully subsumed in. He did a short film for like a Cannes Film Festival compilation, like celebrating the idea of cinema, and it was like a single shot from the back of a cinema as these teens narrate the films on screen, and that has lots of really basic, like, After Effects animation in it. But again, like you say, for Lynch, that almost feels consistent to maybe jump between really, really luscious stuff and really, really badly made stuff.
Yeah.
Inland Empire has a similar feel, where he's experimenting with all those different like different combinations of very early digital cameras as well.
But it works, and I think that's part of the whole
Yeah.
intuition thing. He knows what works together, and he knows how to create these moods and feelings by doing things in certain ways.
And it is reflected by the feeling of watching a David Lynch film, where like you're jumping from like surreal kind of sci-fi horror to like small town comedy, and then like melodrama all the time, like within scenes. And so you really are destabilized as a viewer. I wanted to kind of take that point about Inland Empire and the digital stuff to kind of transition into talking about Peter Deming, who is Lynch's, I think, most long-term collaborator after Angelo Badalamenti, who's the composer he works with.
Yeah, I think so. They've worked together for, I mean, his last, since Lost Highway, I think. I think there's a couple of films that Peter Deming didn't shoot, but it's mainly since Lost Highway they've been working together. Yeah, so I think they have a good working relationship. I think they understand each other to some extent.
Some interesting films in his filmography, and I think it's interesting that a lot of it is horror, because I think Lynch is often unsung as essentially being a horror filmmaker.
Yeah, they're not straight horror films, but the way he does things are kind of terrifying in a way, so it works having things lit in that way.
He's working outside of the horror genre, but as a horror filmmaker, if that makes sense. Like even the nice stuff in Lynch is often horrific in some way.
I think that the best horror films are always films that aren't straight up horror films, aren't they? They're always the scariest.
The first time I kind of noticed Peter Deming's work, already having seen Mulholland Drive but not realizing it was him, was a really low budget horror film he did called Scarecrows, which is truly garbage, but the cinematography in it is really good for a low budget film. I like that quality in him where so much of what he does is all about the shadow, and it's quite simple lighting in some ways. There's not these huge lighting setups, but they're often idiosyncratic. In Lost Highway, I just have a constant impression of that film as being underlit people in front of quite harshly lit white surfaces with like a very low down practical lamp. Usually it's just like a tiny little lamp.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed, but I've never really thought about it before. And you've just brought that up, and I've like, when I think of Lost Highway, I think of like a key light and no fill. I think of like just like a one light setup for a lot of it and things like that, and there's just a lot of shadow in that. I think The Return is kind of similar. Like it's not underlit, but there's not much. It's very simple in its lighting.
My favourite thing, actually, of all the cinematography in the first 2 hours of The Return that I watched is that sequence with Alternative Cooper, because I think Kyle McLachlan is wearing black contacts, or he's just being lit very carefully, but he has those tiny pinpricks of light. They make sure to give him an eye light that's absolutely tiny in every scene, which, as you know, is like this really old-fashioned way of lighting a villain, or it's something uncanny or supernatural, I suppose, about that.
I think especially with the black contacts as well, because you're not really getting... it doesn't look right. You're not getting as much of a reflection as you normally would, but they're still lit, and it kind of adds to that whole foreboding, evil-looking...
And there's something about that stillness as well that really lends to looking at the cinematography, because more so than anything else that Lynch has made, this is just pauses. Most of it is just people sat down not talking to each other, waiting for everyone to start their lines.
Yeah, and it's all locked off on tripods as well, so it's just very, very still.
As far as that power of imagery kind of coming together with cinematography, I think the best the show gets at the start there is that Perspex cube that kind of dominates the first hour of the revival, where you have these young people just sitting down and watching this empty space, which nothing happens in it. I mean, almost nothing happens for the whole time, which I think is not only a really good metaphor for watching the show, but also a really good example of how Deming and Lynch like to use kind of empty space to kind of foreshadow and to scare people, to create this sense of foreboding where sometimes literally nothing does happen. I think about that start bit in Mulholland Drive when they go behind the diner and there isn't someone there the first time. And he's using that to rehearse that scare for you later on, which shouldn't work and yet ends up being like one of the most iconic horror moments in film, I think.
Speaking about like the cinematography element of it, I really liked how they used the box in The Return, that big box. The way it's lit, it's actually lit with some like LED panels, and it's a really weird thing because I was thinking, oh, that just looks like film lighting, but it's like modern. Like normally, if you put like film lighting within a film, you'd use like a classical light that everyone would expect to see, not just like a weird red LED panel. And I thought it was a really interesting decision, that because it also could go with the whole TV and production element that they might be trying to convey.
You're looking at some people watching a box, waiting for something to happen, and everything is surrounded by cameras and lights. And people are just obsessively recording it without any idea why. And that's such an interesting kind of metaphor just to chuck in the start of your revival for a show that everyone used to like but hasn't been on the air for almost 30 years.
Exactly, and that's what they could have been getting at, but like Lynch would never admit to that, would he? So
So I have one more question on my list, which I wanted to ask you, because I think you've kind of spoken about it a little, but it'd be nice to have it outright. And that is like, if you're recommending this to someone, what scene would you pick from The Return to recommend it, and why? And don't spoil it. so something kind of early on.
How can I not spoil it if I have to describe it?
Like an early example of something in the show that you think would sell it to people.
I mean, it's a difficult sell, you know?
Yes. And I mean, maybe more broadly from Lynch's work instead then, if there's like a single sequence across any of his films or in Twin Peaks in the show originally.
Oh, well, the last episode of season 2, you've not got that far yet, but they go into...
That I have seen that, because it's always impossible to make sense of Firewalk with Me without having seen that.
Yeah. Well, the last scene when they're in the Red Room and like all the stuff's up, that's like that is pure like Lynchian terror for me, and that kind of sums up his whole thing. I can't really describe how I feel about Lynch, because that scene is so like, it's so weird and scary, but like it's so amazing that someone came up with that and made it, and it's just like such a crazy thing that like he works with his intuition and he makes these things, and it's weird that we all have that in us as well. We could all make things like that, and it's really inspiring. But I would say like the final, one of the final scenes from season 2, that's like something that sums up Lynch just being... I've actually got a scary Laura Palmer doppelganger tattoo on my arm as well, which is going to be really nice to tell my kids if I ever have them. Just like, this is nice, isn't it?
Yeah, you make it, cover it up, don't give them nightmares.
But yeah, I'd go for that scene because it's just something that just stuck with me and just hasn't left.
It is almost like 11 minutes of just the scariest stuff that's ever been on TV, or certainly up there. I think it's a really astonishing ending to the show.
Yeah, for sure.
Rob, thank you so much for kind of coming here and recommending Twin Peaks The Return, and
absolutely
the rest of Lynch's work as well.
Well, I hope I've done a good job of somehow explaining why it's good, but I don't, like I said, it's hard to describe that sort of thing, and like I think it's just...
As someone who's seen almost all of Lynch's work, I literally couldn't even explain to my girlfriend what was happening on screen at one point in that first 2 hours. It was the bit when you're talking to like a brain that lives on a stick that's kind of covered in lightning. And she was like, what's going on?
How would you describe that to someone? How would you explain that to someone?
I'd have to know what was going on before I told you, so I'm just here to enjoy the ride, you know? Thanks for watching this video. To hear more of our conversation, check out the Indietrix podcast. Just search Indietrix wherever you listen to podcasts to get started.